definitely one of our favorite people to work with in the industry. So Jeremy, with all that flattery out of the way, I'm going to let you take the mic and give us your keynote here. Thanks so much for coming out and joining us.
Thank you, Patrick, and welcome everybody. For those in Canada, the US, on the West Coast, sorry it's so early. I hope you're enjoying your coffee. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'll aim to talk for about 45 minutes and then take some questions afterwards. So Ibogaine in the time of COVID. What are we talking about here? So I'll be giving a backdrop to the pandemic from my perspective. Then I'll be talking about the different lineages of Ibogaine in the US. And then finally, I'll be talking about the immediate pre-pandemic Ibogaine scene, where we are now, and then provide some glimpses as I see it into the future. The idea is to outline the key building blocks of the Ibogaine story in America and its dramatis personae, some of whom will be speaking today, with the key assumption that many listening in may be relatively unfamiliar with the molecule and its history. So while there's a significant backstory of Ibogaine research in France in the early to the mid-20th century, the theatre of action for Ibogaine has been focused on the US since the 1950s, as we shall see. I also want to use this presentation to give context to much of the discussion that will follow across the next 2 days, and to also make the point throughout that we cannot ignore the political dimension to Iboga and Ibogaine that's been present throughout its history. If we are to learn from the past, we must acknowledge the politics of Ibogaine as much as its pharmacological detail. So, scaling the hidden normal. Before we delve into the Ibogaine's history in the US, let's start with a snapshot of our present moment. Regardless of its actual origins, whether zoonotic, man-made, or even panspermic, the COVID virus is a symptom of globalizing processes challenging planetary homeostasis, the age of the Anthropocene, where humans have a dominant influence on the environment and planetary systems. The virus could not have become a global pandemic without global flows of human carriers. It's these interconnections and the carbon-based energy infrastructure behind them which are putting so much pressure on planetary health. Chaotic circumstances, short-term horizons, perpetual crisis, disease, and an inadequate healthcare response has been the reality of most of the world's population for many decades. And this is directly linked either to ongoing capitalist exploitation in the historical context of slavery and colonialism, caste systems, or inequitable planned systems elsewhere. This is certainly the case in Gabon, the source origin of Iboga and Ibogaine, which was exploited both during the colonial period by the French, but has also been underdeveloped in the post-colonial aftermath, most notably in the case of the ELF affair, that's the petroleum company ELF, where petroleum profits from Gabonese oil funded French politics for decades and fueled mega corruption from the top in Gabon. So access to an affordable or free and high quality healthcare system is rare across human populations, and it's actually confined to a few regions of the planet: Europe, Scandinavia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, Israel, and Cuba, to name a few places. And even where there is affordable access, there are often significant class and racial disparities in the quality of treatment. So what we are seeing with the most often inadequate response to the virus is a scaling up into enclaves of privilege, what most of the world's population was already experiencing. So it should go without saying that unless there is a dramatic shift towards political consensus and a much lighter carbon footprint across the planet, we're likely to see something far worse than COVID-19 with climate change in the next few years. So let's go into it. Before exploring the history of Ibogaine in the US, let's start with the source code. Bwiti is a set of communities of spiritual practice, mainly in Gabon, that use Iboga as sacrament as part of an initiation or therapeutic process. Knowledge of Iboga as a sacrament passed to the Fong ethnic group, which are Bantu-based, from forest-dwelling pygmies in the past few centuries. There's evidence that Iboga has been used as sacrament among these forest-dwelling communities for many thousands of years. As with Yage and ayahuasca, the discovery of these spiritual technologies in the West is wrapped up in the colonial project and the extraction of natural resources. Were it not for logging and the search for rubber and other natural resources, these practices would have remained hidden. Note the link between Gabon and Brazil in terms of geological fit. Millions of years ago, equatorial West Africa and Brazil were actually one landmass, as a parallel between the Yage and Iboga experience. So Ibogaine was first isolated from the shrub Tabernanthe iboga in France in the early 20th century. Ibogaine in a low or microdose tablet form was used as a tonic or stimulant in France from the 1930s to the 1960s and sold under the Lamborghini brand. Bwiti culture has been under threat thanks to the biopiracy of iboga, making the sacred wood sometimes prohibitively expensive in Gabon itself. Although currently on a smaller scale than the Amazon basin, Westerners are drawn to visit Gabon to undergo Bwiti initiation in search of ritual and a sacred healing experience. There'll be a panel on therapy in an indigenous context at 9 a.m. tomorrow, and also the talk after that at 10 a.m. tomorrow, this is Eastern time, on Ibogaine and the Nagoya Protocol with Yann Guignon, David Nassim, and Paul Amond Mombe in Dake. Outside the urgent issue of theft of a natural and cultural resource, the spiritual question to ask between the West and Bwiti is this: what happens to mental health within cultures which collectively become de-ritualized and lose relationship to community and initiation processes, elder authority structures, and so on? What happens to human communities that lose a relationship to the environment, to rivers and to forests? Can what has been lost be found in part through Bwiti? Okay, on to America. So it all begins with Harris Isbell. In 1955, Dr. Isbell used Ibogaine on 8 already detoxed African-American prisoners at the NIMH Addiction Research Center, ARC, in Lexington, Kentucky, funded by the CIA's MKUltra program. Isbell was interested in comparing Ibogaine's effects with LSD, which was the main interest from the CIA. ARC was part of the huge narcotics farm complex, which had space for 1,000 patients and was known locally as NARCO, or the farm, which is foundational in understanding addiction treatment in the US. Methadone, for example, was advanced here, as was the disease model of addiction that is now the status quo paradigm of our time. The writer William S. Burroughs remarked that the meals at the farm were excellent. Other guests included Sonny Rollins, Chet Baker, and Elvin Jones, to those jazz fans out there. Alas, there's no recording of the music they made while they were staying at the farm. Ethical standards, such as informed consent at ARC, were far from what we would expect today. Subjects were paid for their participation with their preferred drugs, usually opiates, and it was not uncommon to re-addict patients in order to continue with the experiments. In one notorious CIA-funded experiment with LSD, prisoners were given LSD on 77 consecutive days. That said, it would be a mistake to view Isbell as a black and white, cardboard cutout Cold War figure, sacrificing values and ethics for the search for a Manchurian candidate truth serum at Langley's behest. There were many progressive aspects of the research and the researchers at the farm and at the Addiction Research Center. For example, in 1951, Isbell testified to Congress that, quotes, "Smoking marijuana has no unpleasant after effects, no dependence is developed on the drug, and the practice can easily be stopped at any time." Finally, ARC was the immediate precursor institution to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, which formed in 1974. Now I'm going to play a video based at ARC.
Within the same complex at Lexington is another center. This one engaged in addiction research. Its mission is to investigate the nature of the drugs themselves. Our understanding of the scientific working of drugs, their physical effects on people, what changes they cause in the body, are questions to which we have few precise answers.
Have another one? Sure. Yeah, why not?
That's free.
Yeah, government's paying for it.
Patients from the Clinical Research Center volunteer for a variety of tests involving the actual intake of drugs. To the outsider, these tests may appear meaningless, and from a conservative point of view, immoral. However, they bring us closer to a clearer understanding of the chemical relationship between body and the agent. Whether the agent is marijuana, a marijuana cigarette, a synthetic drug, or one of the opiates.
I gave it wrong.
Highly sophisticated equipment measures the concentration of drug molecules within the body. This enables the researcher to compare what he sees in human behavior with what the instrument reveals the drug is doing to the body's organs, tissues, and chemistry. Through experiments such as the Addiction Center has racked, while Lexington's outpost in the wilderness of drug research was amassing information on the addict and on the drug, little else in the country was being done. Within this,
I'm not sure if you can hear those tones. I don't know what that's about, but I shall carry on. So just 7 years after Isbell's Ibogaine experiments, in 1962, a 19-year-old in New York, Howard Lotsof, we see pictured here, independently discovered its anti-addictive properties after a detour through film studies and filmmaking from the 1980s onwards, promoted its medicalization up until his death in 2010. Dana Beal will be presenting last at the conference and was a long-time supporter of Lotsof and Ibogaine advocacy in the US in general. Let's hear from Howard now.
I was having breakfast with a friend of mine who was a chemist, and he was going through a freezer he had, and the freezer was full of different types of drugs. He pulled out a small vial and said, I think you'll be interested in this. I said, well, what is it? He said, well, it's an African hallucinogen and it lasts 36 hours. So here I am under the influence of this very powerful hallucinogen. And I get home and I lay down, and the Ibogaine is working and working and working and working. And it's 33 hours later, and I only thought to myself, I'm exhausted, I'm going to sleep for a week, and I'm never going to take this drug again. And I got dressed and I walked out of the house, and that's when I realized that I was not in narcotic withdrawal. And I looked at this large tree in front of me, and I looked at the clouds in the sky, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I was not frightened, and perceived that my entire life had been full of fear. Now, imagine that you are a doctor. You spend 12 years getting your education. You spend 15 years in the field becoming an expert. And then the last thing you're going to want to hear is some former heroin addict went and discovered the effective medication that you're looking for. So there was enormous resistance. When you're an addict and suddenly are not an addict, that's a very valuable experience. And I observed how poorly treated addicts are in our society. And I wanted to do something with my life. And the most important thing that I could perceive of doing was producing Ibogaine as an available medically approved drug. And that's what drove me.
So onwards with the show. So in the early 1990s, Howard Lotsof contacted Professor Stanley Glick, who's now Professor Emeritus at Albany Medical College, who, although initially skeptical, was eventually persuaded to start studying Ibogaine in the 1990s with rats. He went on to develop a synthetic version of Ibogaine, 18MC. This second-generation molecule is now undergoing clinical trials in Australia, sponsored by MindMed. Lotsof also introduced Dr. Deborah Mash to Ibogaine in 1991, and they teamed up to prepare for clinical trials. Lotsof Company, NDA International, partnered with the University of Miami. Preparation for NIDA-funded phase 1 trials under her leadership began in 1993, beginning with dose escalation studies. However, NIDA appeared to be acquiring cold feet on Ibogaine research. In 1995, the then head of the Medications Development Division of NIDA, Frank Bwiti, convened an expert panel of consultants to determine whether NIDA should continue investigating Ibogaine. Although opinion was divided on this panel, ultimately the ruling was to go against any further research and close down the project. Ultimately, clinical trials with Ibogaine were discontinued at that time due to funding issues. Lotsof and Mash then fell out in 1996 due to a patent dispute. It's not clear if the argument against Ibogaine at the time was purely for scientific reasons and the cardio-neurotoxicity of Ibogaine, or also for other reasons. At the time, Stanley Glick said, quotes, "NIDA has totally backed away from Ibogaine. There's no question that there's a political barrier. Why it's there, I really don't understand, but I received advice from people I know at NIDA who are acting in my best interest, advising me to work on something else." It may be more than coincidence that this period coincides with the approval of oxycodone, developed by Purdue Pharma, at the very outset of the opioid crisis. Dan Schneider, subject of the Netflix series, is exploring the opioid crisis, called The Pharmacist, is speaking later today at 4:10 Eastern. Dr. Mash, founder of Demorex and the leading academic commercial researcher on Ibogaine globally, is speaking at 1:20 p.m. later today on Ibogaine medicalization. Close to in parallel to Howard Lotsof, Chilean psychotherapist Claudio Naranjo began working with Ibogaine in Chile in the 1960s after meeting a missionary who'd worked in Gabon, who'd mentioned that shamans in Gabon felt pain when lions were shot, a parallel to the Yage experience in the Amazon that Naranjo already knew about. A chapter of his landmark book, The Healing Journey, in 1975, addresses Ibogaine and ends with this thought, which describes the Iboga experience well. Quotes, "The seeming paradox is that this process of attending to actuality in body, feelings, or thoughts appears as a downward movement towards earthly existence, and yet within the earthliness of its forms is found a spiritual entity which beams from above." Naranjo died in 2019, but remains a powerful influence on psychedelic psychotherapy, including Ibogaine, thanks to The Healing Journey and subsequent books and talks. Let's hear from him.
I think the first Ibogaine I got was just pure Ibogaine. I don't remember the source, but I gave it to 30 people. That was my standard number for statistical purposes of comparison at the time. I was invited to the LSD conference organized by University of California in '67, I think it was. It was about 12 of us, I think. Tim Leary was invited, Ram Dass was invited, Allen Ginsberg was, and I received this request through the telephone when I was in Chile, and I asked, could it be that I speak not of LSD, which is not what I have done more, or that is more original, but about Ibogaine, which is what I am involved in right now. And this was accepted. So I was the only one in the LSD conference who talked about Ibogaine. And since everybody was talking about the here and now, I talked about Ibogaine and the there and then. And I probably have at home somewhere the headlines of the following day of the conference, of the first day, Ibogaine, the drug of the there and then, because of the possibility of re-elaborating, redigesting memories, traumatic episodes, and so on. So I was my first subject. My experience was that I was in a borrowed house. I was in a season coming from America, like a holiday period in my time on a Guggenheim Fellowship, I think. Somebody lent me a beautiful house with birdsong and lawn, and not big like here, but small enclosed garden, many bougainvilleas. And at some point, I felt like lying down. And after lying down, I felt as if the whole world was turning around me. And it was like a cosmic dance, a regularity of the orbits of all the celestial bodies. Of course, I was with eyes closed. But the sense was that there is a universal harmony, and I am at the center of everything. I'm not part of that dance. I'm holding on to myself. I'm holding on to something. And I have a sort of miserable life by not joining to this universal life. And part of me wants to be part of it, and part of me is afraid that if I turn the switch, so to say, if I say, let me be, let me let go and be part of everything in its wonderful intrinsic harmony, what if God wants me to be dust? What if I choose by that, through that, to be nobody? I was not ready to be nobody. I was too self-important. And it happened as if there was a timing to the process of decision, as if I had my fingers for too long on the switch. And it was not granted that I had this opportunity. It was too much of a delayed yes. And from then on, and this was very illustrative for me, from then on it was Mickey Mouse. It was cartoons, trivial cartoons, boring cartoons. It's a world of entertainment. So there was no way to come back. It was like as if I had lost my chance. We're not ready.
Now we move on to Leo Zeff. In terms of Ibogaine therapy history in the US, we must mention him. He's also known as the Secret Chief and Jacob. Along with many other leading figures in the psychedelic background that we're talking about in the 1950s and 60s, he had a military background and was formerly a lieutenant colonel in the US Army. Zeff pioneered psychedelic psychotherapy from the 1960s onwards, starting with LSD and Ibogaine, and then MDA, and then MDMA. He was close friends with Alexander Shulgin. He went underground as a leading psychedelic therapist when psychedelic research was banned. His research therapy work included Ibogaine, and he knew and worked with Claudio Naranjo. Zeff said of Ibogaine, quotes, "Ibogaine is something else. It's similar. All of these have certain qualities that are common to them all. Also, no hallucinations. It's a heavier trip, a deeper and longer trip. And for many people, it takes longer to turn on. It's a very profound trip for everybody, but people experience it differently. Some people love it. They love the lessons that they get from it. Some people find it a very painful experience. Those who find it painful are the ones who have not been confronting what Mr. Ibogaine is handing them and have been trying to avoid it. You asked me once before something about confronting blocks. This is a place where people will confront blocks, as a matter of fact, if they've been unwilling to accept them or believe them or often try to deny them. A truth that they've been trying to deny. Mr. Ibogaine won't let you do that. You can fuck it up if you want to, but nobody wants to. You have a great respect for Mr. Ibogaine. You experience it. Great respect. You listen to it. You may not do anything about it, but you'll know that it's true. This is so. Yeah. And I'm sure everybody recognizes Rick Doblin, perhaps the most famous and celebrated person in the psychedelic sector today, thanks to his 30 years hard work with MAPS. What a lot of people don't know is that he was introduced to Ibogaine via Leo Zeff at the outset of his career. And so while MAPS is well known for its work spearheading the medicalization of MDMA for PTSD, the organization has also been a strong supporter for Ibogaine medicalization, sponsoring various observational studies and research, among other activities. As with other molecules, Ibogaine has much to learn from the MAPS experience and the holistic psychedelic-assisted paradigm that the organization has developed. Psychedelics has the opportunity to disrupt the current biomedical model prevalent in psychiatry with a more holistic treatment paradigm, whereby the psychedelic molecule is seen as a tool alongside therapy. Rick will be giving a keynote at 2:30 today. First of all, let's hear him describe his foundational experience with Leo Zeff and Ibogaine.
It was in 1985, and I had been involved suing the DEA, trying to protect the medical use of MDMA. And Leo Zeff, who was the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement, who was the secret chief, he thought that it would be helpful for me to have psychedelic therapy experience so that I would be more effective as a political advocate. And that a lot of it is dealing with your own shadows and not projecting out that, the people that you're fighting are 100% your enemies, that there's some parts of them that are, maybe you could reach them. So Leo offered me a therapy session to try to tune me up as a political activist to save MDMA. And so we went off to a friend's house right on the San Francisco Bay. And the way that he did it, he gave 350 micrograms of LSD along with, I think it was like 4 or 5 grams of Ibogaine.
Wow, is that quite common to mix these two?
Not that common, but the Ibogaine in plant form takes a while to take an effect.
Right.
And so he didn't want to just sit around and wait for all these hours, so he administered them both at the same time. And I could feel the LSD rise and peak.
Yeah.
And then I could feel the Ibogaine like coming up from underneath it. And as the LSD was sort of declining, I felt this Ibogaine take over.
Okay.
So I could kind of distinguish between the two different feelings.
So then what happened? Yeah. What happened with the Ibogaine?
What was, I sort of went through a lot of surrendering, challenging things with the LSD. But it was more or less opening and pleasant. But then, and it was kind of more centered in the head, kind of somehow or other more thoughtful, intellectual, and there were emotions too. But then the Ibogaine came, and the Ibogaine was like this very grounded experience anchored in my stomach. And it started because I actually was thinking in some ways of Castaneda, also of this idea about death over your left shoulder. And that if you're aware of death, that will help you appreciate life. And that you should try to be fully aware of death in all the moments, not scared of it or paralyzed by it, but just aware that every moment is precious and it's limited. So I somehow was feeling this, and then I was feeling that I was holding myself back a bit, that I was scared to let go. And what then developed was this repeated cycle of this sense of the self-perfectionism, that I wanted to be more and more and more. And then was this understanding of the link between self-perfectionism, the self-critical nature, and self-hatred. And I started feeling how destructive this was, and then I would get nauseous and throw up. And then I would feel better for a little bit, and then it would come back. And I would have this sense, though, that when I was throwing up and when I was vomiting and when I was choking, kind of coughing, it was making it hard for me to breathe, and so I was kind of getting closer to the sense of death. And I felt that I just needed to let go, but I was the one preventing myself from doing it. That I knew the solution, and I was the problem. But what I noticed as I was leaving, as this person was driving me back, and I'd never been to this house before, that I could predict what was around the corner. I knew. So somehow or other, I felt like I had burned up all this like self-chatter. Not all of it, but a lot of this inner voice that's constantly criticizing, that it was sort of burned up, and I could have more access to memory and more access, and I kept sort of kind of thinking that I could tell, and I could tell or remember what was coming around the next corner a lot of times. And so that I have this constant flow of what I should have done and what I, and instead of being in an impunitive way, it's something I'm learning from. And I've also learned that there's a lot of opportunities for second chances or second tries, that you do something and it didn't work, and you think the moment's gone and it'll never come again, and it won't. But often in relationships or in what your work is, there's another opportunity to put it into practice, maybe not the exact same way. So I've kind of learned that I wouldn't have these critical ideas if I hadn't done the thing in the first place, and that the doing the thing was the courageous move. And so now I feel like a lot of the success of MAPS, to the extent that we're successful, is because of this constant fine-tuning that is no longer so punitive. So I owe my Ibogaine experience this crucified on the cross of self-perfectionism to separate it out, the self-criticism from the self-hatred.
I hope you could hear that well enough. So let's move on to the Ibogaine clinic scene. As it was just before the pandemic hit. Since the failure to go through clinical trials with the FDA in the 90s, a network of Ibogaine clinics has developed beginning just south of the border with San Diego in the Tijuana, Rosarito Beach area, which is then spread across Mexico and to other parts of the world. And you can see the distribution here in this chart. So there are approximately 100 Ibogaine clinics at this time, just before the pandemic. This doesn't include lone wolf providers using Airbnb and hotels, nor does it reflect the people who buy Iboga and Ibogaine online and take it at home. Up until COVID struck, the busiest clinics would have up to 30 clients per month. So if we take a very conservative average of 5 clients per month per clinic, approximately 6,000 people were taking Ibogaine each year in a clinic-type setting. There's currently little or no visibility on the underground scene in decriminalized areas in the US, such as Denver and Oakland. There are at least 2 live projects in the US to set up Bwiti churches to provide Ibogaine under federal sacramental protection laws, one in Austin and the other in New Mexico, a parallel to the use of ayahuasca in the Native American church. On the research front, there are well over 100 papers published on Ibogaine in peer-reviewed journals, including observational research studies funded by MAPS. The cross-species cardiotoxicity of Ibogaine is well understood, and there is increased understanding, although still far from perfect, of the multi-target receptor activity among researchers. The FDA's Drug Master File on Ibogaine alone stretches to 16 volumes clinical study in Brazil. In Spain, Ricard Fora and Andrea Languaz from ICEERS will be speaking on the community perspective on Iboga, at 3:40 p.m. today. ICEERS is also involved in clinical trials for Ibogaine in Spain, which are ongoing. And then outside of the addiction sphere, there's research at Stanford and via the VETS nonprofit. Marcus and Amber will be speaking at 10 to 5 p.m. tomorrow on this. And the research is concerning Navy SEALs and ex-Navy SEALs veterans who are being sent to Mexico to take Ibogaine to treat PTSD and traumatic brain injury. And they're having stellar results with that. Second generation research led by companies such as MindMed, Gilgamesh, Atai, University of California, Davis are in search of a second generation analog, which is less cardiotoxic and which can be synthesized in the lab or biosynthesized from yeast or from algae. So let's go to today. Ibogaine treatment in the time of COVID. As we're all aware, the pandemic has been devastating in many respects, and for mental health as much as more than physical health. Rates of depression have tripled since the beginning of the pandemic, according to US data, and substance abuse rates from alcohol to opioids have increased 30%. Porn keyword searches have risen between 18.5% and 61.8%, depending on the country, at the beginning of lockdown, according to a study published in Nature magazine. So the growth of underground clinics and online sales of Iboga and Ibogaine in response have surely risen. And this is partly explaining why there is a renewed push to establish Bwiti churches in the US. There's now close to a desperate need for Ibogaine medicalization as an addiction pandemic takes over from COVID-19. There's also the issue of long COVID, long-term debilitating after effects of COVID that prevent people from returning to work. So how does Universal Ibogaine fit into all of this? So the company was set up by visionary founder and veteran broker Shane Nyquist in 2018, together with Dr. Alberto Sola, who's overseen more Ibogaine treatments than anyone else at the clinic in Cancun, Clear Sky Recovery, that Patrick was talking about. Universal Ibogaine is unique in its exclusive focus on Ibogaine. Alberto will be on the panel immediately after this and then giving a keynote later today on the preliminary results from 137 patients at the Clear Sky Cancun clinic. Shane will be on a panel discussing the role of capital markets in Ibogaine medicalization later today. We as a company are now at the business end of preparing a clinical trials application with Health Canada. In step with this, I'll be handing over the executive leadership position to incoming CEO Dr. Rami Battal, who has a preeminent pharmaceutical background in Canada and the US. Given the scale of the opioid crisis, class action suits have put Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family on the back foot, at least in North America. This finally presents a huge political window of opportunity for Ibogaine medicalization, starting with Canada, which has had a progressive regulatory response both to Canada and more recently psychedelics. Dr. Solar will be discussing more on our clinical trials preparatory work later in the conference, so I want to mention here another key aspect of Universal Ibogaine that we haven't talked about publicly that much before, which is our goal to connect with leaders, healers, and creative spirits within First Nations communities, beginning with Canada, to ensure that there is as wide as possible access to Ibogaine. Some of you may recognize the figures on this page: Chief Phil Lane, Lee Brown, who's the former director of the UBC Institute for Aboriginal Health, and filmmaker Penny Gummerson. These are just three of the many powerful souls we will join forces with as we develop both Universal Ibogaine and our newly established non-profit, the IboQuest Foundation. We have a prominent elected and hereditary chief on our board, Chief Ian Campbell. He is leading the effort to connect the circuitry among Indigenous leaders and across time build a strong connection into the work that we're doing. Chief Campbell will also be on the panel on Ibogaine medicalization at 12:10 p.m. today, and also discussing Ibogaine in an Indigenous context at 9 a.m. tomorrow. The goal with our foundation and community engagement thrust is to ensure that Ibogaine is introduced as a tool of transformation in First Nations therapeutic settings, providing economic empowerment, validation of Indigenous healing practices, and an alternative option for those seeking healing, whatever their background. As part of it, there is a strong desire within the company to forge connections with Bwiti communities and leaders in Gabon. So let me finish by trying to glimpse into the future of Ibogaine. Certainly further research is required on Ibogaine and its analogues and the neurodegenerative benefits to combat long-term neurodegenerative effects of both long COVID and who knows the mRNA vaccines themselves. We simply don't know if there'll be any long-term neurological effects of the vaccines. Beyond addiction, there's much research to be done on applying Ibogaine's unique neurotrophic benefits to traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, and also PTSD. And as I mentioned, Marcus and Amber Capone will be touching on this tomorrow. Beyond that, there is huge potential for micro or low-dose Ibogaine or Iboga as a wellness tincture, going forwards by going back to Lamborghini in France in the 1930s to the 1960s. This is one clear path to avoid or minimize the QT prolongation issue of Ibogaine, and as Tobias Henry will explore tomorrow, a prototype tool for consciousness hacking. As Ibogaine medicalizes, there'll be the opportunity to go through your Ibogaine experience in the local community and move much more seamlessly into the all-important aftercare. Key here will be to ensure Ibogaine is placed in an ecotherapeutic context, returning us to wild being, nature, the earth, and community. This will be a topic discussed at the pre- and aftercare discussion tomorrow. It will also be important to avoid, as far as possible, a purely individuated and medicalized approach. A biomedical approach of just taking Ibogaine will not work. As Johan Hari said, the opposite of addiction is not abstinence, it's connection. Ibogaine alone, outside of a therapeutic pre-treatment and aftercare setting, is far less effective in terms of long-term outcomes. So as we contemplate our collectively uncertain future in COVID's wake, we shouldn't forget Leo Zeff's comment that Mr. Ibogaine is a plant teacher who will tell us the truth. As Ibogaine finally begins the process of medicalizing, we should not forget the powerful spiritual levels at which the molecule also operates as we seek to walk towards a more balanced future on the planet. Okay, now open for discussion. Any questions?
Coming on to say hi, and I'll start off with the questions here. You got a lot of thanks, and that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Jeremy. What was it originally that drew you to joining the team at Universal Ibogaine?
Well, a massive bow and a debt of gratitude to Patrick, who was speaking just previously. He invited me on to take his place on the board as he moved on to other things. And yeah, I have a background of deep interest in Ibogaine for the last decade. So this, I was doing voluntary work for Ibogaine, putting on conferences and whatnot. So the opportunity to join the UI board and spend a time being CEO, taking the company to the next step it was just gratitude for that experience, basically.
Beautiful. And, I've noticed through the production of this conference that Ibogaine seems to be a fairly tight-knit community, and, a lot of the people within it know each other. Are you watching, kind of the growth of it and noticing any substantial differences between when you started and today as we host this conference?
There is this whole debate that, is more general to psychedelics about going the biomedical route or the psychotherapeutic route. So keeping these things in balance, definitely as a company, we're trying to do both. We realize that, look, Ibogaine failed to go through clinical trials in the 90s, and the FDA, my experience helping to set up an Ibogaine clinic in Portugal a few years ago. Ibogaine alone, it does do the reset, but it doesn't on its own back give you the long-term outlook. It's up to people, down to the setting and the intention and the work on the part of the person and the therapeutic support. Somebody had a question about Ibogaine and MK Ultra. Yes, it's definitely a lesser known fact of that program that Ibogaine was involved, and Dr. Isbell was the main person involved in that, and he was interested in comparing and contrasting LSD with Ibogaine.
In Soviet Russia, Ibogaine do you. So I just want to remind everybody to use the Q&A section of the chat bar. And I'm going to move over there as, otherwise the questions kind of get lost in the feed of chatter. Brian Rufo is asking, as soon as it comes back up, specifically in the US where people can't get legal access to short acting ahead of a visiting clinic, is there a solution yet for folks addicted to long acting opioids?
That's a really good point. Alberto Sola, I can see, is online, and he will address that in his own way. But if you can't get hold of morphine sulfate in situ where you live, then one option is to go to where the clinic is and then be put on morphine sulfate when you're there on an outpatient basis. Drugs like, as Patrick mentioned, drugs like buprenorphine are very long acting, and they stay on board for a long, long time. So it's not ideal if you don't have access to an SAO. So yeah, I think best opportunity, if you can't procure it where you are, is to pre-treatment go to where the clinic is and basically switch over there.
Fair enough. Alan Hout, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, is wondering, I keep getting new questions and it refreshes. Give me a second. As we have the benefit of hindsight, looking back at the history of Ibogaine in the West, how do you think future generations will speak about Ibogaine in our present time today?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Fire.
Oh my God, intake of breath. We lost time. I touched on it, the politics of Ibogaine, why it got cancelled in the 90s. I have a very strong hunch that it was the lobbying of Purdue Pharma, dare I say it. It was that wave of, the new meds that were coming that pushed Ibogaine to the side. And that panel that I mentioned that was convened was just doctored. Now, I have no proof for that, and I have to caveat that is my opinion. There's no evidential proof out there that happened, but it's just such a coincidence that, the mid-90s, 95, 96 was the beginning of the rise of oxycodone and the end of Ibogaine's opportunity. So we have to look back and say it's with incredible sadness that we have, had 3 decades essentially of the opioid crisis blowing over us and just devastating communities. So we'll look back and we'll rue the day that, Ibogaine was effectively defunded back then. The other point to make is that it's still going to take a while to get Ibogaine through clinical trials. In the case of the US, it has to be declassified because it's still Schedule 1. And we're still in neck deep in a harm reduction paradigm. Many people in the Ibogaine community sort of don't have much respect for harm reduction. I'm not one of those people. I see people working on the front line in needle exchanges and whatnot as heroes, doing very difficult work. Ibogaine is simply a tool to add to the work that they do. There are some closed minds out there in terms of, the addiction profession, but there are some open progressive minds as well. So what we're trying to do is across time slowly introduce awareness of Ibogaine. People often have questions about its cardiotoxicity. Again, Dr. Sola can speak to that. In the Clear Sky Cancun clinic, we've had 3,500 plus patients. Nobody died. It's far safer statistically in a clinical setting than methadone. So yeah, people looking back will say, God, you guys took a long time pushing this through. And there is going to be a gap, of COVID, post-COVID, increased addiction issues around the world, and the ability to have legal access to this medicine. There's going to be a gap, and that's going to be a very painful gap for people to go through. I would love Ibogaine to medicalize, to legalize, to be approved in Canada, the US, in 1 year or 2 years. But unfortunately, Ibogaine's power, its multi-target receptor power, is also its drawback. It's not like psilocybin, a simple 5-HT2A, serotonergic activator. It's doing things with the NMDA receptor, the opioid receptors, nicotinic receptors, and on and on and on. So, and it is cardiotoxic. So we have to take our time with the clinical trials. But that's, there is going to be a rough period for us all ahead of Ibogaine medicalizing.
Safety first. Dr. Maroof is wondering, is there any back channel discussions with Dr. Tedros, WHO, or Dr. Biden to hack the obvious political blockade to Ibogaine?
Well, as many people listening in will probably know that President Biden's son, Hunter, went for Ibogaine treatment, and certain Ibogaine activists have been lobbying as hard as they possibly can to get visibility on this. So who knows? We do live in a time where medical regulators have been put under a lot of pressure to fast track COVID vaccines. This is another thing to say. Is there an opportunity to fast track, Ibogaine medicalization? Maybe if we join forces. It will be about collaboration. It will be about the World Health Organization having this on their radar. A collaborative effort to distribute clinical research. We as a company are completely up for that. We're only doing Ibogaine drug development because it hasn't been done yet. Our focus is to give people Ibogaine in a safe medicalized setting. So if there can be a fast-tracked collaborative effort, so be it, bring it on.
Dr. Sergey Kodoli, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right as well. Today there's a lot of information about Ibogaine in clinical practice, but there's no fundamental data, pathogenic mechanisms of the effect of Ibogaine on the body. How relevant is this direction?
That's true to an extent. There's a lot of, as I mentioned in the presentation, there's a lot of interspecies data on the toxicological effects of Ibogaine. There's a bunch of observational studies which have been done on human subjects, as I mentioned, funded by MAPS. I think it's safe to say that the somatic effects of Ibogaine are short-lived. So it's common if you have slightly higher doses of Ibogaine to have ataxia, where you can't really, you lose motility. But, that is a 24-hour type window, and then it dissipates as the Ibogaine is flushed out and it's metabolized into noribogaine. Certainly, there's a lot more different types of research that need to be done on Ibogaine in all different realms. As Dana Beal will be talking about, one interesting aspect of Ibogaine's mechanism of action is it seems to stimulate the production of neurotrophic factor, glial cell-derived neurotrophic factor, possibly via activation of the serotonin transporter. We know very little about that at this stage. So there's certainly massive research both on Ibogaine and second-generation analogs of Ibogaine in terms of GDNF and different receptor activity that's ahead of us. So while I said that there's been hundreds of papers written on Ibogaine, yes, there is a lot more research ahead of us to truly understand the molecule.
Fantastic. I think our last question for this panel from our very own Gaurav. Why do you think people's experiences, hallucination-related, differ so much with Ibogaine? Do patients undergoing opioid detox experience different subjective psychotropic experiences than those using it for depression or psychospiritual growth?
I think, there's the scientific answer to that, and there's more of a spiritual answer to that. The scientific answer would be, look, people have different layers of experience, as we know from people like Dr. Gabon Weate. There's an intrinsic relationship between, childhood trauma and repeat child for the explanation of why people have very different experiences with Ibogaine. And then the spiritual answer would be, look, Ibogaine and Iboga as a suite of molecules are switching our field of consciousness away from operational, everyday, working consciousness, where task-oriented consciousness, to the death realm, to the realm of the ancestors. And, whether it's epigenetic data or whether it's spiritual ancestral data, we're all situated differently on that plane of consciousness, which would then explain why, for instance, a bunch of people who have Ibogaine experiences, they're in a tropical, there's lions, there's black people, there's an African setting. It's sort of like their consciousness is being switched to that level. Other people don't have that. Other people, they see a bank of TV screens and they see those childhood traumatic experiences being replayed. So, yeah, the site of the trauma, the epigenetic, the genetic, and the spiritual ancestries are all combining in incredibly complex ways that we simply, the neuroscience and the spiritual science is not there to understand quite yet.
Kind of like a fingerprint. Everybody's different.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation, Jeremy. I'm going to go ahead and hide myself from the screen, let you say some final words, and then we'll take a 3-4 minute break before the next presentation. Let the show go on.
Thank you. So, I think the challenge for Universal Ibogaine and for other companies that are starting to look at Ibogaine is that we're not operating in a vacuum. That there's a lot of work being done on addiction. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of vested interest. There's a status quo harm reduction paradigm. And we don't want to come across as better than thou. We want to listen. We want to understand. We want to learn how best to embed Ibogaine as a tool into those existing circumstances. And personally, for me, it's the meeting of the opportunity to provide Ibogaine treatment in Indigenous, First Nations, and other marginalized and deprived communities, and to revalidate historically denigrated spiritual practices. So if you think about Canada, so many different First Nations spiritual practices and technologies, which are fortunately coming back to the forth. And we in the company, it may not be known outside, but we spend a lot of time thinking about that. Building those relationships is going to take years. So we've started that process. And ultimately where we want to go is to join forces with Gabon and Bwiti communities there and make sure that they're empowered and their voice is heard. So yes, we're focused rigorously and ruthlessly on Ibogaine medicalization, but we're realizing that there's a huge context in which this is going to take place. So thank you very much for listening, and on with the show.